Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 8th of October of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the most important area. We're going to talk about the Kurakhove direction, where the Ukrainians most likely were encircled by the Russians on the line between the villages of Gornyak and the village of the Kurakhove. As you can see, we have made some changes on map. We have colored the significant territory in Russian favor because today on the 8th of October the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Zoriane. This is very important progress. There is some interesting details and things that I would like to discuss with you because something is very important, because today the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported the Russians managed to take under control the village of Zoriane Pershe. But if you take a look at map, you won't see the village of Zoriane Pershe. There is a village just Zoriane. But in the previous times during the Soviet Union, this part of Zoriane used to be the village of Sofiyivka. And later the sources reported that this village of Sofiyivka was renamed in Zoriane Pershe, and later somewhere during the New Ukraine, somewhere after the 10th or 20th of the century, the Ukrainians united the central Zoriane, the southern Zoriane, and the eastern Zoriane in one big village and called this village just Zoriane. No Zoriane Pershe, no Zoriane Central, just one big Zoriane. And once again, according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, this small street with a significant number of buildings were captured by the Russians. And based on this video, we have colored this territory in Russian favor. So this is the situation on the ground on the 8th of October, and this is the situation on the ground on the 7th of October. We have a lot of changes, as you can see. The most important is that this contested area was colored in Russian favor because we got the confirmation from the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation. Of course, lots of people can have some doubts whether the Russians managed to take under control Zoriane and whether it's normal to believe the Minister of Defense report. So in favor of the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, I would provide you another important video and another important geolocation. If you remember, during the previous week, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation also reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Verkhnyakamyanskaya. We got this report on the 2nd of October, and based on this report, we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. And then during the talks about Verkhnyakamyanskaya, we were very surprised, and that was obviously unexpected, and it was very difficult even to believe this information, and we obviously were expecting for additional videos or geolocations that can confirm this significant Russian progress, because if Verkhnyakamyanskaya indeed fell, then the Russians have no problems to attack further in the western direction and to begin the battle for the Siversk and for the Siversk agglomeration. And today on the 8th of October, the Russian sources did publish the video. Let's take a look at the video first. Let's take a look at the building. So this is the building. I would like to point your attention and to try to keep this building in your mind. And this is the video of how the Russian soldiers were discussing the situation on the ground, of how the Russians were conducting and carry out another offensive operation. And in the final part of the video, we can see two scenes with the two Russian flags. This flag was established in the village of Zhelanne Pershe, and this flag was established in the building in the most western part of Verkhnyakamyanskaya. So I would like to point your attention to details, and if you have better quality map, you will always be able to compare and to find that these are exactly the building with the Russian flag. So once again, a week ago the Russians reported, and now 1 week after, the Russians published the video with flag, which most likely means that the Russians control not just the western part, but most likely the Russians managed to move even deep further in the territory of Siversk, and currently I'm not even sure where exactly the edge Russian positions. So let's return back to the village of Zoriane. So we're moving back to Verkhnyakamyanskaya just to understand and to analyze the reports of the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, which obviously sometimes are telling us the real and correct information. So now we're returning back to the village of Zoriane. The territory was captured, and now let's discuss the Gornyak and Kurakhove Cauldron. So as you can see from this perspective, after the fall, after the contested area was completely colored in Russian favor, now we can clearly see the cauldron we've been talking about for the previous few days. The Russians are trying to encircle the Ukrainian positions from the northwest, and we have already discussed the situation in this area. According to different reliable sources, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation during the previous days, managed to improve their positions along the railways, along the tree lines, and to dig in deeper between the village of Izmailovka and the village of Novoselidovka. During the previous few days, the Russians also improved their positions along the railways by taking under control the village of Ostrovska. Currently 50% of the village of Ostrovska and the village of Maximilianovka under complete Russian control. We're talking about this territory. So obviously the settlements and the cities and towns in this area are encircled. As for this territory, during the previous few weeks, we've been talking a lot, more precisely since the beginning of months, about the significant number of FPV drone attacks along the main supply road, along Death Road between the city of Kurakhove and this agglomeration. Today we received additional batch of FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian forces along this territory. The significant number of vehicles were destroyed as a result of Russian FPV drone strikes. We have the video on the outskirts in the vicinity of the village of Vilenka, and we have another video from the territory of Kurakhove itself. The Ukrainian vehicle was moving and the Russians destroyed. But I would like to point your attention to a few more interesting things. There are few settlements: the village of Alexandropol, the village of Vovchenka, the village of Kurakhovka, the rest of Zoriane, Gornyak, and Izmailovka. And if we calculate the population of all these settlements, the population of this area is around 20,000 soldiers. This town of Gornyak had the population before this operation around 12, 13, 15,000. 15,000 people. The village of Kurakhovka had around 3,000 population, and small villages around, probably summarize everything, maybe 2,000-3,000. So 20,000 agglomeration was encircled by the Russians, and this is the real encirclement. This is not the situation in Ugledar. This is not the situation in Bakhmut, because if we compare this cauldron with the cauldron in Ugledar, we see that Ugledar was 10 times less when talking about square kilometers. The square of this small city, small town Ugledar, was 10 times less in comparison with the Gornyak-Kurakhove agglomeration. Furthermore, if we compare this agglomeration, this encirclement, this cauldron, let's say, with the Bakhmut-Artyomovsk operation, then we can't call Bakhmut-Artyomovsk operation as the real encirclement, because since the beginning of Russian offensive and during the entire Russian offensive and assault operation, the Ukrainians were able to control the main supply roads that were located inside of this area. So we are talking about the positions between the village of Kalinovka, Bogdanovka, Khromovo, T0506 road, the cemetery, Ivanovska itself. So even after the fall of Bakhmut, the Russians haven't managed to take under control these positions, and this is the perfect foothold, perfect place to have supply evacuation. Of course, the Ukrainians were suffering significant losses, but despite the losses, they were able to make rotations, and in the end of battle for Bakhmut, the Ukrainians were able to escape the complete encirclement and to save as many as possible personnel. But when talking about Kurakhove, Gornyak, the Ukrainians have no chances to do this, because if the Ukrainians began evacuation, the Russians already established complete control of FPV drone control over the territory, which the Russians didn't have during the battle for Bakhmut. This is the first thing. And the second thing, if Ukrainians decide to evacuate, then they will be forced to do this through the open air and fields. And this is the lowlands. This is the lowlands, and there is no problems for the Russians to control this territory using the landfills, the terracons in the vicinity of Ukrainsk, or in the vicinity of this mine between the village of Tsukurina and the town of Gornyak. This is the second thing. And the third thing that I would like to point your attention, that since the beginning of the special military operation, this Gornyak-Kurakhove cauldron is the first real cauldron that was created by the Russian forces when talking about such sizes of agglomeration. Of course, we are not talking about Mariupol. We will not compare, because Mariupol is much bigger, but this is completely different situation. This is completely different situation with Bakhmut, as we discussed. As for Ukrainsk, this small town, 10 times less, we discussed this. And as for, let's say, Avdiivka, the Russians haven't managed to encircle Avdiivka. Avdiivka, as Russians were pushing, and Ukrainians in the end decided to fall back. And as for Severodonetsk, Lysychansk agglomeration, there were no encirclement as well. So this is the first real encirclement, the first real cauldron that the Russians created since the beginning of the special military operation, or the second cauldron if we count Mariupol cauldron also as a part of a row. But we can't do this because it's a little bit different situation, right? It was the beginning of the special military operation. The Ukrainians were unprepared, many other things. And this is the real cauldron where the real and motivated army of Ukrainian forces got entrapped and ambushed in this area. We don't know for sure the exact number of Ukrainian forces that are currently located there, but obviously the number is big. And the thing is why the Ukrainians haven't ordered to evacuate their personnel from this cauldron is simple. On the 12th of October, the Western countries, NATO countries, are planning to conduct a Ramstein summit where most likely the NATO countries will lift any restrictions from Ukraine to attack deep inside of the territory of Russian Federation. Every single leader of NATO countries is going to take place in this summit. Right before we start making the video, we got report that Joe Biden is not going to take part in this meeting due to the storm that is coming to the southeastern part of the United States of America. So it's very difficult to explain or to understand what was the real purposes, whether really the weather and the storm was the reason, or Biden decided to not to give Ukrainians authorization to attack deep inside of Russia using this method. We don't know for sure, but obviously the number of countries' leaders are enough to give the Ukrainians additional help, additional weapon to continue the special military operation. So this is the reason why Zelensky haven't given the order to escape this encirclement. He just wanted to have the line stable until the end of this meeting, until the end of this summit. But most likely during the next few days, the Ukrainians will face another nightmare, another disaster for their forces, and another 2,000-3,000 soldiers would be encircled, and the Ukrainians will have the significant problems in this direction. And the loss of this agglomeration can lead to complete breakthrough, to complete collapse of Ukrainian lines. And I'm not even sure where exactly the Ukrainians will be able to stop and slow down the Russians. Now let's move further and let's talk about another very important direction, about Zaporizhzhia direction, because I believe we can start calling this area as a Zaporizhzhia direction, because the second day in a row we continue receiving updates that shows additional progress on the ground of the armed force of Russian Federation. In this video we can see the Russian soldiers that were moving between the buildings, that they were hiding somewhere between the trees, between the brushes, and many other things, and how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians. One of the episodes was located exactly in this point, and based on this video we have added additional territory under complete Russian control. This is very important video because just yesterday we were talking about this operation in this part of the village by the name of Plavny, how the Ukrainians were ambushed by the Russians. Now we got the video of how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians in completely different side of the village, and these two videos during the previous few days confirm that the Russians continued their concentration of forces in this part of Plavny. We see that this is another area where the Russians develop another disaster for the Ukrainians, because when the Russians are able to get the critical mass in the village of Plavny, they will launch the full-scale offensive operation with the purpose to encircle the Ukrainians first in the village of Kamyanska, and after that the Russians are going to move further in the northern directions towards Stepnogorsk, or the Russians may begin moving through the former Dnipro and Kakhovka water reservoir in the direction of Zaporizhzhia. The Russians can do whatever they like, and this can lead to the significant problems and significant consequences for Ukraine. But once again, the Western countries are planning to probably to ultimatum Russia by saying that we accept that 20% of Ukraine are occupied by Russia, and the rest 80% will join NATO and will join European Union, and then during the next 10 or 20 years we will make every single possible diplomatic effort to return this territory, to this 20% back to Ukraine. So this is something like going to be a Cold War with the purpose to force the Russia and Russian Federation to fall back from these territories. Obviously this is not the thing that the Russians are going to accept, but this ultimatum is very tricky, because if somehow Zelensky is able to force NATO countries to accept Ukraine in NATO or on the terms that the territory that is not under Russian control will join NATO or will get the or will get some obligations from Western countries that these territories would be protected. This situation means that if Russia, let's say, begin offensive operation in the direction of Mirnograd, and if Russia are able to cross another 5 kilometers in the direction of this small town, this will allow the NATO countries to use the fifth paragraph and to join this war. So this is very risky and very dangerous meeting on the 12th of October, but Joe Biden decided not to visit this meeting because, as I understand, he realized the consequences of this meeting and what kind of things can happen after that. Now let's move further and let's talk about additional directions. Once again, let's return back to Siversk area. We have the significant number of artillery strikes at geolocations of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces, and we see that the Russians, we got the real geolocation, the real confirmation that the Russians managed to establish complete control over Verkhnyokamyansk. All these things, summarizing everything, means that the Russians are going to start the real full-scale offensive operation in the direction of Siversk from many directions, from the southern direction, from the eastern direction, along the railways, through the village of Vyimka. And the most important, today we got very interesting report from the forest, from the Kremenная forest. The Russian armed forces have broken through the Ukrainian armed forces defenses in Kremenная area and have begun clashes fighting for the village of Serebryanka and Grigorovka. I'm not sure how exactly the Russians managed to reach this line. Maybe the Russians were attacking from the north, maybe the Russians were moving from the east, from Bilogorovka. But one thing I know for sure, that during the crazy crisis and difficult period for Ukrainians in New York and Toretsk, the Ukrainians decided to redeploy the forces of the 12th separate Azov brigade. Main purpose was to unblock the Ukrainians that were trapped in this industrial zone, and most likely the Russians used that situation, that opportunity, and broke through the Ukraine defense belt. And maybe the next few days we're going to receive the significant number of geolocations already from Serebryanka, from Grigorovka, and maybe from the town of Siversk itself. If we are going to get some updates, then this is going to be another disaster for the Ukrainians, and once again I'm not sure where exactly the Ukrainians are planning to stop the Russians. As for the Kupiansk direction, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything. The Russians are regrouping, the Russians are concentrating the critical mass, and very soon, very likely, the Russians will cut the territory in two. Maybe the Russians are waiting for the 12th of October as well as we do, but the only thing we got and we know for sure that currently, while the Russians are trying to concentrate forces in the flower of Peshane, the Russian aerospace forces are bombing and attacking the Ukrainian logistic. Few more pontoon bridges were destroyed in the vicinity of Kupiansk and Kupiansk-Kozlovoy, which is very important. While the Russians are concentrating the forces, the Ukrainians are suffering the significant losses. As for the Sudzha direction, no changes in comparison with the previous update, just Ukrainians counterattacks to the west of Sverdlikova and to the southwest of Lyubimovka, and based on the videos and geolocations and map updates of different mappers, we have adjusted map back in Ukrainian favor. So let's take a look at the video. In this video we can see several Ukrainian personal carriers that were attacking the Russian positions exactly in this point. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map in Ukrainian favor. So this is the situation on the ground for yesterday. So most of these territories were considered as the contested area. That means that different mappers, reliable mappers, provided updates about Russian control, but without any geolocations. And now we got the geolocations about Ukrainian progress, and we have restored control over these territories by the armed forces of Ukraine. So this video confirms and means that the Russians have no plans to continue further their Sudzha counteroffensive. Now their main resources are concentrated in the Pokrovsk and in the South Donetsk directions. And as for this area, the Russians managed to get the main objective, the main goal, to restore the supply roads between the town of Korineva, Vishnyovka, and the town of Glushkova. So now they are not going to do anything more right now. Now the Russians managed to repel Ukrainian attacks, and now everything as for Russia, everything is good. The Ukrainians are forced to keep the significant number of forces here. The Russians managed to secure the roads, they managed to stabilize the situation, and while there is the significant number of Ukrainians have the significant problems in the South Donetsk and the Pokrovsk directions. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.